Hi, I talked about this verse last time that says, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." And I said that I was looking at this because of something that happened in my life. A couple years ago, I went through a couple surgeries, and they made me really aware of my mortality. Made me think about the fact that although I think I'm going to live for several more decades, I don't really know for sure. And I mentioned that I had come to the place for a while where I was sort of giving up on life. And God convicted me that that was not the right attitude, that I needed to be excited about the years I have left here on earth and how good they could be. So I was thinking a lot about these verses. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And trying to understand, what does this mean when it says to live is Christ? So what I want to do in the next several videos here is to look at this passage in a lot of detail, really drill down into the meaning of that. I'm going to start with this one, with looking at that specific phrase, to live is Christ. Now, what it basically means, I'll tell you right up front. It means being physically alive in the body gives me the opportunity to labor fruitfully for Christ. That's it. But what I'd like to do for the rest of this time is briefly look at the other things that it could mean and explain why that's not what they mean. It's what I just said. So first of all, if you just take the phrase to live as Christ, that's such a rich phrase, and the words have so much possible meaning that it's easy to misinterpret. For example, you might think this means that Christ is the source of our spiritual life, that to be spiritually alive is Christ, that Christ is my life spiritually. And that would all be true. Christ is our life spiritually. But that's not what he's talking about in this particular passage. Because in this passage, he's not talking about spiritual life. He's talking about physical life and death, not spiritual life and death. So two reasons for thinking that. First of all, if you look at the context, here's what's going on. Paul is in prison. He's facing a couple of possible futures, the extremes. One extreme is that he might actually be executed. This could end his life. And the other one is that he might even be released and be able to go back to his ministry as an apostle. So he's looking at those two things and comparing them and trying to see how he feels about them both. And he says, well, on the one hand, to die would be gain. And on the other hand, to live is Christ. So he's comparing the actual physical possibility of being put to death with the physical possibility of being left alive. Secondly, you can see that it has to be physical life and death because of what it says about death. It says to die is gain. But spiritual death is certainly not gain. Physical death is the thing that's gain for believers. Spiritual death, in fact, is a kind of physical death for a believer is, in fact, actually spiritual life, even more life than we had before. But physically, it's death. And the same way he's talking here about physical life as opposed to being put to death physically. So this is talking about physical life. So secondly, you might say, okay, so I agree that this is talking about physical life, but isn't it still saying that our life comes from Christ? That our physical life also comes from Christ? And that's also true and also biblical. Romans 8 has some verses that sound like they're saying that our physical life comes from Christ. But that's also not what this means. It's not saying that our life comes from Christ. And to see that, think about what it says about death and gain. It's not saying that my death comes from gain, or that my death is caused by gain, or that the source of my death is gain, of course. What it's saying is that death brings an opportunity for gain. And in the same way, this isn't saying that my life is caused by Christ or comes from Christ, even physically. It's saying that my physical life leads to an opportunity for Christ in a way that death doesn't give. You can also see that perspective in the little phrase, for me, at the beginning. When he says, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain, he's telling you that he's talking about his own perspective, his own viewpoint about life and death. And he's saying, this is what execution would mean for me. This is how I view it. I rejoice at it, because it would mean an opportunity to be with Christ, and that would be gain. And then in the same way, he's saying, but this is what being left alive would mean to me. This is how I view it. I rejoice at it, because it means an opportunity for Christ somehow in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. All right? So how is it an opportunity for Christ? You might think, oh, it's an opportunity to know Christ better. Because 2 chapters later, he says knowing Christ better is the most important thing in the world to him. And that's true, but it's not what this passage is talking about. Because it's true that being alive gives us an opportunity to know Christ better. But death would give us even more of an opportunity to know Christ better. If my goal is to know Christ above all, then death is something I definitely welcome because I get to know Christ so much more when I finally go to be with him. He's talking here about something that's unique to being alive, that doesn't happen if we die. And so what is he saying? Well, let's look at the next verse right afterwards. He says, but if I'm to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. That's the thing that being alive gives him. the opportunity that being alive gives him that he doesn't get from physical death. He gets the opportunity to labor fruitfully in this body on this earth for Jesus. And that's what he means when he says, for me to live is Christ. For me to be alive is to have the opportunity to fruitfully labor for Christ. So that's the essential meaning of to live as Christ. It's saying what being alive in this body on this earth means for me is the opportunity to fruitfully labor for Christ in a way that I never could otherwise. And that's what makes it so important to me to be alive. Thanks.